So hello, everyone. I'm Helen Rosenfeld. I'm the Executive Director with the Massachusetts Science and Engineering Fair. Thank you so much for joining us today for our speaker series. We're running this for a couple of weeks, every Tuesday through Thursday from 3:30 to 4:15. So thrilled to have you guys on board. I will say, starting that if you have interest in continuing the dialogue with any of our speakers afterwards, please get in contact with me. I'll share this at the end as well as a reminder. For now, we're keeping all of the video and audio on mute, but please feel free to use the chat function for any questions you have, and I will facilitate a Q&A later on. So I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Ceci Hinojosa, and she's going to introduce herself. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over the speaking to her. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. Okay, perfect. So hi, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be speaking with you all today. My name is Ceci Hinojosa, and today my plan is to tell you a little bit about my path to science, which includes what I did when I was an undergraduate, as well as the work that I'm completing now as a PhD candidate at Tufts University. Then we can, of course, open it up for questions, which I'm very much looking forward to. Okay. So I am originally from El Paso, Texas, which currently is best known for the pop star Khalid, as well as the football player Aaron Jones, who is the running back for the Green Bay Packers. I was born and raised in El Paso, and so were both of my parents. And it's unique because it's right on the border. It's a border city with Mexico, and it's right next to New Mexico as well. So how did I get interested in psychology? So broadly, psychology is the scientific study of the human mind and its functions, especially those affecting behavior. So initially, I became interested in psychology in middle school. So I became fascinated actually with reading the biographies of serial killers. This won't get any more morbid, but I found it so interesting how these individuals wanted to kill, what drove them to kill, why didn't they have why couldn't they inhibit their urge to kill? And so I did some research, and I wanted to see how I could potentially make this a job. How could I talk to these individuals and find out the answers to my questions that I was looking for? So I discovered that I could actually have the occupation of being a clinical psychologist and talk with these individuals. Specifically, I found out that in order to have a career in clinical psychology, I actually needed to get my PhD in clinical psychology. So from that day on in middle school, I made it my goal to get my PhD in clinical psychology. However, during high school, I also grew passionate about serving my country. So I really wanted to join the Air Force. Both my father, my grandfather, and my cousin were in the military. And because of that, I wanted to also join the military. So I graduated actually a year early from high school. So I was 17 when I graduated. And because of that, in order to join the military, I would need to have my parents' permission. Now, since my dad was in the military, he really didn't think that I would like it, so he didn't want to sign me over. And so I was stuck wondering how else I could serve my country while also pursuing my career for psychology. And so that's when I thought that maybe instead of speaking with serial killers, I could help servicemen and women who came back from war try to recover from the traumas that they had experienced overseas. So in high school, I changed my area of focus from interviewing serial killers to studying post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And it was from then on in high school that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist for the Army. So my parents, neither of them went to college. My mom has her high school diploma. My dad actually dropped out of high school when he was 17. He ended up going back to finish his diploma to be able to join the military. So neither of my parents ended up going to college. And because of this, the path that got me here wasn't easy. It had some luck had to do with it, but also my determination to get my PhD to achieve my goal was really what drove me to where I am today. So just a little bit about my home institution where I did my undergraduate degree in El Paso. The home institution is the University of Texas at El Paso, or UTEP. The acceptance rate is 100%. So literally, if you apply, you will get in, which is great because this makes college accessible to anyone. There is around 25,000 students who go to UTEP. It's a commuter school, meaning that you don't have to live on campus during your first year like many other places. And it allowed me the ability to live with my parents and not have to pay for rent, which helped me save money to apply for graduate school. And so when I was applying for colleges, I really didn't even apply anywhere else. I knew I was going to go to UTEP when I was growing up. A lot of individuals who are in El Paso, who live in El Paso, usually they end up going to UTEP. My major was psychology with a minor in history. A little more demographics about UTEP. A large majority of the undergraduate population is Hispanic or Latino. Again, we are unique in that we border Mexico. And a lot of the diversity of faculty, majority, again, is Hispanic or Latino. So also too, this is a New York Times article I wanted to bring up. It just illustrates that the students who attend UTEP are rather poor. So they come from families who don't make a lot of money. The median family income was $37,000. And so some of the questions that my parents and I had when I was applying to UTEP, thinking about going to UTEP, was how are we going to pay for it? And so UTEP isn't really expensive if you are a resident, a Texas resident. It's roughly $7,000 a year to attend. And how I paid for my college was filling out the FAFSA. So through the FAFSA, I found out that I received a Pell Grant, which covered some of my tuition. But I also found out that I received a Texas grant. So this grant is specific to Texas residents. And basically what a grant is it's an amount of money given to you by the government that you don't have to pay back at all. So it's not like a loan. It's almost like a scholarship, but again, you don't apply for grants. They're given to you. So again, I didn't apply for the grant. Ultimately, Texas saw that I was eligible for it, and so they gave it to me. So this is just a little kind of piece to let you know to keep an eye out for potential grants that you may be eligible for, and also to keep an eye out on scholarships that you should be applying to. Don't think just because you can't afford college that you can't go to college. There's alternative ways for paying for college. Okay, so once at UTEP, I spoke with a current graduate student who was in the PhD psychology program at UTEP. And I asked her what I needed to do to prepare me for graduate school. And she told me that since graduate school is very competitive to get into, you need to have research experience. And so that's what I started doing my sophomore year, going into the summer of my sophomore year. And so basically what I did was I applied to work in this lab, the neural basis of addiction, that was led by Dr. Laura E. Odell. And so what I did was I applied for a summer internship that was funded through the National Institutes of Health. And they basically paid for me to live on campus. So I lived in a dorm that summer, but I also got paid roughly $3,000 for just a stipend for living expenses. So I was able to save that money that I received and helped me pay for graduate school expenses as well. So here in the lab, we studied nicotine addiction in diabetic rat models. So we actually induced diabetes in rats and saw their response to nicotine. So studies in humans have shown that individuals with diabetes actually smoke more cigarettes and have a harder time quitting compared to individuals who don't have diabetes. And so really what we wanted to do in this lab was to determine or better understand the underlying mechanisms of that. And so you can see that there's a little schematic of the paradigm that I use called conditioned place preference, or CPP. So basically what we did is we had rats enter this compartment that had two sides. The sides were both different. They had the ability to cross over to each side. One side had checkered flooring with black walls. The other side had clear flooring with white walls. And we basically just timed how long the rat spent in each side. Once we knew the preference that the rat had for the side, we then gave them nicotine injections in the side that they initially did not prefer. And so we put a divider in between the compartments so that they wouldn't be able to roam each side, and we gave them nicotine on the side that they had first not preferred. So here you can see the rat is given cheese, but we gave our rats nicotine. And we let them just sit in that area for around 15 minutes. And so after multiple pairings of nicotine in the non-preferred side, we then retested the animals to see whether or not they had changed their preference. So this paradigm allows us to measure how rewarding the rats found nicotine to be, because if they were to stay in the side that they were given nicotine, that means that they really liked nicotine. And so our results showed that rats who were diabetic stayed on the side paired with nicotine more than the non-diabetic rats. So this is telling us that diabetic rats actually found nicotine to be more rewarding than non-diabetic animals. So that could be one of the mechanisms that makes it harder for humans to stop smoking. So while working in Dr. Odell's lab, I was able to apply for funding opportunities that was specific to UTEP. And so these funding opportunities allowed me to work in the lab as well as focus on my schooling and not have to find an additional job outside of school. So in my freshman year, I was working at the mall part-time, but these opportunities allowed me to quit that job and just focus on research and my studies. So one of them for UTEP is called Corey. The other one I was a part of was called Building Scholars. And so basically, since I was living at home, I was just kind of saving my, my checks, which allowed me to pay for graduate school expenses. So I urge you, if you're interested in conducting research, please look for opportunities like these that might be specific to your institution that you choose to go to. So while being an undergraduate, I also was in a social cognitive laboratory. So I was in 2 labs during my undergrad. And this laboratory was led by Dr. Michael Zarate, who's a social cognitive psychologist. And in this lab, I partnered with a graduate student who was a veteran, who hypothesized that individuals under stress will better remember negative images more so than positive images. And so to test this hypothesis, we had participants view images that had varying degrees of valence. So valence is how positive or negative something is, and arousal. Arousal is how emotionally provoking something is. So for example, here's an image of a neutral image where an individual is just sitting at a computer. Here's an image of negative with low arousal, negative with high arousal, positive images with both low arousal and high arousal. So what we had participants do is just basically look at these images. We then had them read a boring article for 20 minutes, what's called a filler task. Then we showed them another set of images again, and of those images, some of them were previously seen and some of them were new. And so we asked participants to tell us which images they had previously seen and which items were new. But to induce stress, we told participants if they answered a certain number of these wrong, there was a possibility that they could be shocked. And so we had a mouse pad that had some shockers hooked up to it. Literally, we were never going to shock them, but just the thought of them maybe being shocked induced stress. So now something that you may notice about the labs I was in during undergrad is that they had nothing to do with PTSD, but that was okay. I was only looking to get research experience. At the time, UTEP didn't have a PTSD lab. They still don't have a lab that focuses on PTSD, but I knew in order for me to be competitive and apply for graduate studies, I needed to have that research experience. And so for 3.5 years, I was in 2 labs that literally had nothing to do with what I was interested in. But through these research opportunities, they kind of changed my focus. So I was introduced through Dr. Odell's lab, the world of neuroscience that I had never known existed before. And so I became passionate about neuroscience. And for graduate school, I actually focused on applying to labs that combined neuroscience research with PTSD research. So I found out that maybe clinical psychology specifically wasn't the route that I wanted to take. So this brought me to Tufts. It was fall 2016 that I joined the Tufts community. Straight from undergrad, I joined Dr. Lisa Shin's laboratory, and in her lab, we're interested in better understanding the differences in both brain function and structure in PTSD. So with that, what is PTSD? So in order for an individual to be diagnosed with a disorder, they need to have endured a stressor. So for this example, the stressor could be you're overseas in Iraq, you're in the military, and your convoy runs over an explosive device, and that triggers a traumatic event. And so that doesn't necessarily mean only individuals in the military experience traumatic events. This can also be brought upon by experiencing a motor vehicle accident, as well as sexual assault, or any other physical assault. After experiencing that traumatic event, an individual needs to also have symptoms. So some of the symptoms are intrusive recollections of the event, which means that they have nightmares or flashbacks about the event, avoidance of anything that reminds the individual about the event. So a lot of the times, veterans, when they hear fireworks popping off, they get afraid because they think it's gunfire. Also, Hummers, civilian Hummers, might remind them of Humvees that they were in when they were overseas. Additionally, there's negative alterations in mood and cognition, where an individual might feel guilty about having survived the traumatic event while their fellow soldiers did not. And lastly, there's hyperarousal and reactivity, where an individual might have an exaggerated startle response. They might not be able to have their back to the door, or they might have a heightened sense of fear and arousal. And so in our lab, we're interested in comparing the function of the brain of those with PTSD to individuals who do not have PTSD. And to do this, we use functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. You may be familiar with an MRI scanner, which is presented here, if you've ever broken a bone. So sometimes doctors may image the bone to see how badly it's broken using this scanner, or they may see if there's any other tissue that's affected by the injury. But in this context, for my studies, we have individuals get into the scanner and we take images of their brains while they view different stimuli or complete different tasks. And so this big donut thing right here is actually a magnet. So basically what's happening is that our brain requires a lot of energy to function. Now, our brain doesn't store energy, so we acquire this energy via glucose and oxygen that is obtained through blood. So blood is constantly flowing through our brain. So when we use a part of our brain, such as right now, we're all using our visual cortex because we're looking at the images presented on the screen, that part of our brain uses energy, or glucose and oxygen. And so what happens is that we need to replenish this area so that we can constantly use it again. And so that means that that part of our brain that's in use is currently deoxygenated, so there's deoxygenated blood, and we need to replenish that with oxygenated blood. So basically what the fMRI is doing is it's measuring the ratio between deoxygenated, so blood that doesn't have any oxygen in it, to oxygenated blood. So for example, here are some stimuli we show our participants. Here's an example of a fearful facial expression. So fearful facial expressions are extremely important to us as humans because they provide us with information about our environment. So fearful faces alert us that there could be something potentially dangerous in our environment. Here's an example of a happy facial expression. Happy facial expressions let us know that everything is okay and there's nothing that we need to worry about. So basically what we're doing is we're measuring brain activation when individuals view fearful facial expressions, and we're subtracting that brain activation to when they view happy facial expressions. This is ultimately letting us know what regions are important for processing fear. So for example, let's say that this is our brain. So this is an axial cut. So if you were to cut your brain in half and look a bird's eye view on top of it, this is the eyes and these are the ears. You would see that an individual may respond to a fearful facial expression in this way. So the orange means that there's activation happening in that area. When they see happy facial expressions, this is how their brain might respond. So basically what we're doing is creating a contrast image. We're contrasting these images to see what the brain is responding to, specifically in regard, or how the brain's responding to fearful facial expressions. And here we can see that now there's much less activation going on because we subtracted everything that's similar between the two images. So here's an example. This is a coronal view. So if you were to cut the brain in half vertically, you would see that there is fearful facial expressions may have activated what's called the amygdala. So what we're learning is that the amygdala is actually very important for our everyday lives because it signals whether, or prepares us to prepare our body to be ready for flight or fight. So if we see something that's potentially dangerous, the amygdala prepares our body to react to that by fighting that thing, or to flight, to run away from that thing. And so we see that in individuals with PTSD, this area right here is actually more activated than individuals who don't have the disorder. However, on the other hand, some regions are actually less activated in individuals with PTSD, and this is denoted by the blue color. So what we see here is that the medial prefrontal cortex, which controls the amygdala's activation when situations are no longer dangerous, it tells the amygdala to stop activating. This is actually deactivated in individuals with PTSD, meaning it doesn't work as well as it should. So it seems that the amygdala is overpowering the medial prefrontal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex can't control the amygdala anymore. And so that's some of the research that I'm currently doing now. That's kind of the end of the formal part of my talk, but of course I am looking forward to all of your guys' questions.
Thank you for that, and thank you for making your research so accessible to us.
Yes, of course.
I'm going to invite everybody to use the chat function without alarming you and taking you off mute. And then if anybody has more questions, I can take you off mute for that. But I'll start us off. And please, no question is too small. So feel free to ask what's of interest to you. So I'll start things off by asking you to think back to high school a bit. And you seem to have a pretty early idea of what you wanted to do and what interested you. But for those who are either in that situation and trying to construct a community of support around themselves, can you give anybody pointers on how you found people who could guide you through that process? Right. Because I think a lot of students have shared that, that yes, they might have a teacher that's interested, but if you don't have parents or adults in your life who share similar interests, how do you find people to support you through figuring things out academically and then for the future?
Great question. So for me, basically, I had showed this interest that I had in studying serial killers to my English teacher of all people. And my English teacher actually bought me a book about serial killers to see whether or not I would be more interested. It's like a forensic psychologist had written a book. And after reading it, there was this really cool quote. And it said, "Don't become the monster in which you study." And so that quote kind of like really opened my eyes. And I was like, I don't know if I could talk to these people every day and like be able to fall asleep at night. So that was one thing that kind of like changed my idea of what I wanted to do with my life. But she was really the only one that I had. And she wasn't even a science teacher. But there was a science teacher who I had for AP biology. And he was instrumental because he always made me feel like I had a place in science. It's not that anyone was telling me that I didn't, but he made me feel like I was actually good at science and that I could do this for a career. I never told him that I was like interested in becoming a scientist or anything, but the way that he interacted with his students just made me feel really good about myself and that I actually was doing a good job and that I could become a scientist. But there's also, looking back, I mean, I really didn't have anyone, but there's so many resources now for students. So there's a page that actually shows some internships that students can look for now who are in high school. So you don't have to gain research experience just in undergrad. You can start looking for these opportunities even now. And I think Massachusetts does a great job of trying to pair students who are very interested in science with students like me who are willing to share their time with these students. So I think if you just look for programs that are currently available, that would be really helpful. So first, I would say talk to your teachers, to your science teachers, but also, you know, an English teacher really changed my life. But then also look for these opportunities, because there are research opportunities for high schoolers out there now that I did not have any idea about when I was in high school.
We can share a lot of that on our social media platforms too, for folks who aren't yet following us or who want to find that information out. I'd be happy to share that. So the flip side is perhaps what's down the line for you in the future. So maybe you can speak a little bit about where you envision this leading you.
Yeah, so when I came to Tufts, I really, since, you know, El Paso, all of us are, the minority is the majority. All of us are Mexican Americans. And so coming here was a huge, like, total wake-up call. I never experienced prejudice. I mean, I don't now, but just I can see the division. And because of that, it's really made me want to do outreach programs just like this, because I've always felt that I could become whatever I wanted to. No one told me that I couldn't, but I can see where that could happen. And so because of that, I really want to go back to UTEP, become a professor, and let these students know, you know, UTEP isn't the end goal. Like, you can go across the country and make something of yourself in many places. Because a lot of times people back home, a lot of kids, they just feel like, oh, I'll just get my degree in psychology, my bachelor's, and it'll be fine. I'll find a job. They don't know that the next step is graduate school for them. So I want to be that person that lets them know that there's many, many other things that you can do, and that you can get your PhD. Because a lot of kids back home, they don't think they can. So because a lot of their parents never went to college, even went to college. So I hopefully want to go back to UTEP and be that person that helps others.
That's great. Full circle, right?
Exactly.
One of the questions we have here is, what was your biggest roadblock on your path to becoming a scientist?
I think what it is currently is me. Like, there's this syndrome called imposter syndrome, where you feel like you're not good enough to be a scientist. And I feel like now back at UTEP, I was in everything. I was in 2 labs. I was doing a great job. My advisor would tell me how amazing I was, but here, everyone's amazing. Everyone's doing a great job. So I have to feel like I match up with these people. And, you know, it's hard because their parents went to college, they come from a lot of money, and I feel like I don't belong here. So I feel like what's going on in my mind, that imposter syndrome, is really the biggest roadblock for me. I still have to learn how to deal with that. But I feel like as scientists, we all deal with that. And I'm still working on it. I'm trying every day. Hopefully one day I overcome it. But ultimately in science, the most important thing is your science that you're doing. You have to make sure that the science you're doing is good science, and that you're putting your all into it, and that you're not making any mistakes, and that you're not just publishing to publish, because in our field it's publish or perish, but that's not how it should be. It should be publishing good science because you think it'll change our community. So
great, thanks. We have another question here, which is, did you consider doing research with the Army?
Yes, I have. So getting a faculty position, especially now because UTEP is an R1 institute, meaning that it's very good at conducting research and getting grants to conduct research, there's a possibility that I might not get a faculty position. And so because of that, what my second option that I would love to do is to work with the Army. And so El Paso has a huge military base. It's called Fort Bliss. And my other dream would be to become a research scientist at Fort Bliss and still work with PTSD research in that capacity.
Great. I have a question about how our present circumstance with COVID-19 may be impacting your work and your peers, your colleagues.
Right.
Maybe you can share a little bit about how that's impacting research as a whole.
Yeah. So it's so tough. So I am in a really good position because with fMRI research, basically we have participants complete multiple tasks within one study session. So the project that I'm working on now, that task and all of those data were acquired years ago. So right now, what I'm doing is I'm able to remotely analyze that data just with my laptop. I don't need to be meeting with participants right now. I can just, it's mostly on me. I can analyze that data. I can write up the manuscript. I can have conversations with my advisor through Zoom. But with it, for other individuals who actually have to run participants currently, I know some of them are going to be behind a year. And I've even been talking with my advisor from back home who does animal research. A lot of those animals had to be sacrificed because they couldn't use them. So that's money down the drain. And so I'm very thankful because I'm in a good position because all I have to do is analyze data at the moment. But there's a lot of studies that have been put on the back burner for good reason. I mean, we shouldn't be interacting with a lot of people currently, but a lot of people, I'm going into my 5th year, so I should be finished with my PhD this upcoming year. But a lot of people, in order to get the data for their dissertation, will have to add on another year. So it'll take them 6 years to complete their dissertation.
Well, we've had a great slew of questions. I wonder, before we sign off, if anybody else has anything else to ask, please feel free to add it to the chat. I want to thank Ceci for your time and really for kind of creating a really nice timeline of your personal story with your academic story. I think that's really helpful, and to sort of illustrate how it can take a number of different paths. And how it started with literature, which is really interesting because most of the time people don't think of science career starting off with books, right?
Yep.
So I want to thank everybody on the call today. I want to thank you, Ceci, for your time. And I encourage everyone on the call to join us for our subsequent speaker series. And if you have any questions or are interested in any specific topics going forward, please feel free to email us at info@scifair.com. We'd be happy to find some resources that are specifically relevant to what you're interested in. So thanks again for your participation, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.